afternoon, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the Flint Institute of Arts Museum and Art School. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture. It's pretty unusual to say today because we don't normally have one during the day, but Dr. Charney, who's with us all the way from Slovenia, kindly said he could do a couple lectures today, so we thank him for that. As I mentioned, we're privileged to have Dr. Noah Charney with us for 2 lectures. This afternoon, it's The Thefts of the Mona Lisa, which you're about to hear. Then at 6 p.m., he will return for a talk titled Brushed Aside, The Untold Story of Women in Art. So both are very exciting topics. Following each lecture, there will be a Q&A and a book signing in the lobby, because both of these lectures are based on books that he has recently published. They are available for sale in the museum shop. Many of you may recall that Dr. Charney was our Thompson lecturer way back in 2017, and he spoke on the art of forgery. And then also earlier this year, he did a virtual Sheppy Dog Fun lecture on the Chinese zodiac figures, which was very interesting. And if you didn't check it out, it's available on our YouTube channel. It's very interesting to check out. The Sheppy Dog Fun lectures were established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing these wonderful lectures, bringing these wonderful lectures to the FIA. After tonight's lecture, so the next Sheppy Dog Fun lecture will be November 21st. It's on a very interesting topic that intersects with the art world, which is absinthe. It will be given by Dr. Justin Sledge, and we're also going to have an absinthe tasting afterward, which you have to purchase. The lecture is free, but you have to be 21 and purchase tickets for the absinthe tastings, but that's going to be a fun night. So mark that on your calendar. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support, which is so deeply appreciated and vital to the FIA. Also, a big thank you to the citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of the FIA by means of the Genesee County Arts Education and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which also provides free entry every day of the week to Genesee County citizens. Thank you. And thank you also to Huntington Bank for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone beyond our county entrance to the FIA for free on Saturdays. Thank you to the Ford Foundation Equity Fund at the Community Foundation of Greater Flint for making the ASL interpretation possible today. Now, please take a moment to silence your electronic devices. Dr. Noah Charney is an international best-selling author of more than a dozen books translated into 14 languages. He's professor of art history, specializing in art crime, and has taught, among others, at Yale University, Brown University, and the American University of Rome, just to name 3. Dr. Charney is the founder of the Association for Research into Crimes Against Art. He writes regularly for major magazines and newspapers, including The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Observer, and the Art newspaper. He lives in Slovenia with his wife, children, and their hairless dog, Hubert Van Eyck. Love that. Everyone, please join me in a warm Flint welcome for Dr. Noah Charney.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Hello, thank you for having me. I love coming back here. I ate a coney dog today. That was the thing to have, right?
Just shut this off.
So I'm going to give these 2 talks today, and if anybody would like to come to both, you get extra credit points, but no pressure. I wanted to begin with the subject of my latest book, which is The Thefts of the Mona Lisa. And you've probably heard that the Mona Lisa was stolen in 1911. It's probably the most famous peacetime theft of any object in history. Certainly the most famous art theft. But what I want to tell you today is some extra stories. We'll go in depth behind the scenes about how it was stolen and why, but also why Pablo Picasso was accused of having stolen the Mona Lisa. He was innocent of that, but he had stolen other things from the Louvre. So that's a fun little twist. And if we have some time, then I'll talk to you about the fate of the Mona Lisa during World War II, which is complicated and interesting, and also about the multiple versions of Mona Lisa and whether any others could be by Leonardo, and why there's a lot of intrigue and confusion about 4 in particular that are interesting suspects for possibly being at least from Leonardo's studio. So I have my magical PowerPoint. I'm terrible with technology, so I guarantee something will go wrong. But so this is some of the books. I've now Tracy, the bio's 8 books out of date, but that's okay. We'll catch up when I come back in 5 more years. We'll catch up with another one. I do live in Slovenia. Most of the teaching I do is online. So if anyone's interested in taking one of my courses, you can do so. I teach for Yale University online. And actually, this fall, I'll be teaching a semester-length course based on the subject of this afternoon's lecture, Brushed Aside, about the story of women in art. I also teach for the National Gallery in England online and the Smithsonian. And I also do a lot of basically public outreach. I'm a sort of pop professor. I don't work full-time at any university, too much administration. But I host TV shows. I did a BBC series, and if any of you were with me virtually for the talk about the Zodiac theft that Tracy mentioned, that was a few months ago online as part of the same series. That was based on a BBC series that's free that you can go online and listen to. And then I also do various things like I do podcast hosting, very random. I'm also the ambassador of tourism for Slovenia. You weren't expecting that, were you, right? So I do a lot. I appear in videos and promoting Slovenia and this sort of stuff. And I also have online courses through the Great Courses series, which basically looks like a TV show that you can watch. That's over here. You can listen to it through Audible or get it through Wondrium or the Great Courses. And I write TED videos and these sort of things. So I'm trying to do as much public outreach as I can because I want to talk to real people, not fellow professors. They're fine, but I don't usually want to go hang out with them, except for this evening, Tracy. Dinner's going to be great. So let's get down to business in this story, because there's a lot going on here, and I want to walk you through it. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to dramatize a little bit, as I imagine it would have been, to make it a bit more vivid, but this is based all on the best available research. So I want you to imagine it is early on a Monday morning, around 7 a.m. on the 21st of August, 1911. And Vincenzo Perugia has locked himself into a janitor's closet inside the Louvre Museum in Paris. And he's been there all night. He probably didn't smell too good. He was very sweaty. And he was listening for the footfalls of the security guards to disappear down the corridor. He knew that the Louvre Museum had over 400 rooms, but only around 200 guards when it was open to the public. But it was closed on Mondays, and so there were far fewer guards. And when the footfalls disappeared, he very slowly and cautiously opened the door to the closet in which he was hiding. And he made his way across to the Salon Carré. And you can see in this little map his path. And the Salon Carré was the main room where the Mona Lisa was displayed, along with many other monumental paintings from the Renaissance. And you can see this is the room here. And it is kind of sandwiched between these other paintings the way it was displayed at the time. And he moves over to the Mona Lisa and he lifts it in its frame off the wall. And he does so smoothly without clonking it around, which should have been a clue for the investigators. It didn't help them in the end, but it should have been, because it was hung in a way that if you didn't know how to lift it off of its hooks, you would have had to wiggle and wongle it a little bit until you figured out how to lift it, and it would have made quite a lot of noise. And he tucks it under his arm and he heads towards a service stairwell. And the staircase led down to the court of the Sphinx, and his plan was to exit through a courtyard and then disappear into early morning Paris. But before he did that, at the top of the service stairwell, he removed the oak panel on which the painting was made and separated it from its ornate Baroque gilt frame. So this crazy-looking frame has nothing to do with the original work. It was framed afterwards. A lot of museums do that. And the original work is on panel. And of course, it's much less cumbersome outside of its frame. So he discarded the frame in the stairwell. He wrapped the panel in a white sheet, and he headed down the stairs. And when he got to the bottom of the stairs, he reached out his hand to open the door to go out of the museum into the courtyard of the Sphinx, and he twisted the doorknob, and it was locked. But he thought something like this might happen, so he had some tools with him. So first, it looks like he may have thought to remove the hinges from the door to try to open the door that way, but he figured that would take too long and make a lot of noise. He did try to remove the doorknob from the I don't even know what you call it, the technical term, but the thingy that the doorknob is attached to. That's the technical term for it. He removed that. He unscrewed the doorknob, put it in his pocket, but the latch was independent of it. The door wouldn't open. And then he heard footsteps coming down the stairs towards him. I'm going to stop there, just to leave you in maximum suspense, so then you have to sit with me for all the useful historical information until we resume our adventure. But this is Vincenzo Peruggia. Who is this guy? He was an amateur painter, a mandolin enthusiast, lovely mustache, and he was from Dumenza, which is outside of Milan in Italy. And he was part of a very large expatriate community of Italians living in Paris circa 1900 until the First World War. And it was a community that was honestly looked down upon by most Parisians. There was, I don't know if you call it racism, but among Parisians, the idea was Italians were there to do the jobs that were beneath us French folk. And they were barely tolerated, and they were thought as sort of second-hand citizens. And so they tended to keep to themselves. He was there hoping to make a career as an artist. We don't really know much about his art. He must have not had as much talent as he would have liked, because he didn't make a go of it. But he did get a job as a handyman for a company that was subcontracted by the Louvre to make protective glass cases to secure some of the most famous works, because back in 1907, a woman who was a political activist had attacked a painting by Ingres with a knife, and they were worried that other people might do the same. So he basically worked for this company that was contracted by the Louvre to make these glass cases, and one of the cases he was supposed to make was to cover the Mona Lisa. Now, Peruggia was under a mistaken apprehension that is still commonly believed. He thought that Napoleon had looted the Mona Lisa from Italy. That was a pretty good guess, because Napoleon, in fact, looted tens of thousands of objects from Italy during his Italian campaign, including tens of thousands alone from the papal collections around the Vatican. But this was not one of them. The Louvre still has many works that were taken during the Napoleonic era. And the Louvre, when it was converted from the French residence of the French royal family after the Revolution to a museum, it was run by a guy named Denon. And Denon is a hugely influential figure in the history of museums, because the way he conceived of how museums should be displayed and curated is largely the way they are today. He also had a very good eye. And he had a wish list that he gave to Napoleon and his generals. If you happen to pass and take over the following territories, wouldn't it be nice to get X, Y, and Z works of art? And Napoleon was the first general to make it a habit that any treaties, armistice treaties, had a requirement that the loser forfeit cultural heritage objects. It's not the first time that happened historically. He was the first general to make it, this is the thing we do. And what he did was successful in that some of the Italian city-states surrendered to him rather than engaging, because they figured they're sure to lose and they're going to lose their cultural heritage, and they were left alone largely in doing so. But the ones that engaged in combat, starting with the armistice with the Duke of Modena, they had to forfeit huge amounts of objects. They also, this is even worse, they had to pay for their own cultural heritage to be shipped off to Paris. This is like they got stuck with the UPS bill. So there were tens of thousands of objects taken to the Louvre, but this wasn't one of them. So what's the deal with the Mona Lisa? Why is it the most famous painting in the world? Why is it maybe even the most famous object in the world? That may be too much of a statement, but I think one could argue it. Let's just do a little backstory about what made it so famous and what it is. So it is a portrait by Leonardo da Vinci of a woman named Lisa Gherardini, who was a merchant daughter who married a minor nobleman named Francesco del Giocondo. Francesco del Giocondo was friends with Leonardo's father, and he commissioned young Leonardo, starting in 1503, to make a portrait of his wife. He never got the portrait. It was officially, according to Leonardo, never finished, and he probably was never actually paid for it. This was sort of a favor, like, your son's an artist? Oh yeah, is he any good? Well, okay, can you paint my wife? Sure, why not? This was a sort of deal. It wasn't exactly high-flying. But he did begin it, and the term in Italian for this painting is La Gioconda. In French, it's La Joconde, which basically means the Giocondo woman, so the white, or Mrs. Gioconda. That's where it comes from. So Giocondo was the name of her husband. Why is it so famous? It is a beautiful high Renaissance portrait, but there are probably about 24 that I would say are on a similar level. I don't want to sound like I'm bursting a bubble, but this is one of the great works of art history, but there's nothing absolutely unique about it that makes it far better than other high Renaissance portraits, including others by Leonardo. His Lady with an Ermine, if you ask me, I much prefer it and find it more interesting. But there's a whole cult that developed around this, and here the question is why. So to understand that, we need to step just a little bit to the side and talk about Giorgio Vasari. Giorgio Vasari is the subject of another book of mine. He was the godfather of art history. He wrote a book in 1550 called The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, which was a Renaissance bestseller. And in it, he portrayed as a group biography the artists he most admired, many of whom he knew. So he was from Arezzo, which is in Tuscany, and he had a very pro-Tuscany focus. This is where all the best art is, and he couldn't really be bothered with people who weren't from there, especially if they weren't from Italy. Albrecht Dürer and Jan van Eyck don't even appear in his book about the greatest artists. But, and I'll talk about this afternoon, he does have a chapter on some great Renaissance women artists, and his focus was Michelangelo. Michelangelo was a buddy of his, and according to him, Michelangelo was the greatest artist in any media who could ever have lived. And I think you could argue that that may be the case still to this day, but he definitely had a bias. And Leonardo was part of his bias because Leonardo was from Tuscany and worked in Florence, among other locations. And so there was a cult of Leonardo and Michelangelo because of the essentially PR provided by Vasari's book. He had an edition in 1550 and another in 1562, and they were translated into all the languages you can think of throughout Europe. And even today, if you study Art History 101 or about Renaissance Italy, you'll probably be assigned to read Vasari's Lives, as they're called. And so he talked about this painting already as particularly famous and sought after. And one of the reasons why it was particularly well known internationally, because while prints can travel throughout Europe very easily because they're more affordable and made on paper, for a painting you have to go to the place where it is. There's only one of them, and you have to make a pilgrimage to it, and these were not available to everyone. Perhaps they were in a church. This would have been in a private family home. That was its original intention, or maybe in a palace. And if you don't have access to the works of art in question, you won't see them. It's hard for us to imagine today because we're bombarded by images. But until really the 19th century, the number of images that a person would have seen in their lives, you could maybe count on hands and toes, fingers and toes, hands and toes. Very few. We see more images in a minute than most people pre-19th century would have seen in their whole lives. So you have to keep this in mind, the power of images, which is infinitely less now just because we have so many of them. So this was something that was disseminated and famous because it was beloved by François I, Francis I, the King of France. Francis I was an Italianophile. He loved everything Italian. Who doesn't, right? He also loved pictures of beautiful ladies, preferably with as little clothing on as possible, and he collected them, especially if an Italian made them, he had to have them for this collection. He also collected artists. He's interesting for the history of collecting because he seems to be the first collector who proactively sought to get works of art by artists they admired, regardless of what the work of art was. That's unusual. Most people who commissioned works of art commissioned a specific subject for a specific purpose. For example, I need you to paint me an Annunciation painting for my family chapel in this church, or can you paint a picture of my wife? That was normal. François I said, Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo, all the Ninja Turtles except Donatello. He lived a generation before, we know that, right? The fourth Ninja Turtle should be Titian. You probably knew that already. I'll buy anything you can send me. And not only that, he collected artists too. He invited Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo to live in France under his patronage. Most said no, but Leonardo said yes, as did some other famous artists like Rosso Fiorentino and Benvenuto Cellini. And Leonardo was set up in a castle in the south of France towards the end of his life and spent the end part of his life in France under the patronage of François I, who got first dibs on any work of art that he would make, and also bought whatever was in his estate when he passed away. It passed on to his assistant, Salai, and was acquired by the French king. And this was a work that was among those acquired. Leonardo had kept it for effectively his whole life, thinking it had never been finished. We'll get a little bit later to why he never thought it was finished, because there are at least 4 different paintings on the Mona Lisa, 3 beneath what we see here. And he kept changing it and playing around with it. So François I loved this. He kept it officially in his toilette. That doesn't mean he kept it hanging over the toilet, which is what people tend to think, but it was in his suite, bathing suite, we'll say. And he loved it, and he would show it off to people. And lots of artists from the French court copied it, and there are loads of 16th century copies, so not contemporary to when Leonardo was making it, but within the next few decades. And it was also disseminated as a print. And so that's part of what made it popular. Then when we get to the 19th century, we get the first English language edition of Vasari's Lives. And British collectors and art enthusiasts become fascinated with Italy, particularly with Tuscany and Florence, and all the artists that Vasari said were the best. And so we have the perhaps over-focus on Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo, and on Florence. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on elsewhere, but that was the hyper-focus of the Anglophone world, and then it extended to the US as well, and we get famous essays about the enigmatic smile of Mona Lisa. We get Nat King Cole singing about her, and it becomes the most famous artwork in the world. This is one of the few artworks you show it to pretty much anybody anywhere on the planet, and they'll know at least what it's called and who made it. They might even know where it is, but it probably doesn't go far beyond that. And that's why I think it was interesting as an exercise for me to write a book that is, if you buy one book about Mona Lisa, that's got everything you need to know in it. Of course, the crime stuff is part of the fun. So what's Picasso got to do with this? This is young Picasso when he first moved to Paris, and he lived in what was called the laundry boat. That was his nickname, Bateau Lavoir. It was very falling apart. Think of it like, anyone see the movie Animal House? Jean Belushi. It's probably like that, but in the Montmartre neighborhood of Paris, and it was a squat with various artsy types living in it. And Picasso was trying to make a name for himself, but he hadn't quite yet. But in 1906, he went to an exhibit at the Louvre Museum of ancient Iberian statuary, so Iberian from Spain and Portugal, from that peninsula, which he hailed from. and he spotted 3 statue heads that he was really taken with, one in particular, which really stuck in his mind. And this ancient Iberian statuary looks quite abstract and geometric, almost cubist. You can see why it resonated with him. It broke down the basic forms of a face into geometric shapes, and this is what he enjoyed doing with his art, although he hadn't developed that style yet at this time. This is in his blue period, and this is the kind of art that he was making, which looks rather different from what we might tend to associate with him. So he was involved in an incident in 1907 with him and his best friend, Guillaume Apollinaire. Apollinaire, you may have heard of, he was a Polish-born Francophone poet and art critic. And these two were like the men about town in Paris at the time. They were seen at all the cool bars, the cool like down and out bars, not the fancy ones. They were the go-to artist types. Their photos were taken and appeared. This was a golden age of newspapers and magazines. And so you would have early tabloids, which would have photographs and prints in them. And you also had magazines and newspapers that came out multiple times a day. This is how news was disseminated. And they were regulars, and there was one magazine for which Apollinaire wrote the art criticism. So they hatched a plan largely inspired by a guy with a great name, Honoré Joseph Géry Pierret. He was a Belgian, I'm going to say a Belgian con man because this was kind of one of his things, but he, at the time, was the personal assistant to Apollinaire. He also would later spend his twilight as a cowboy living in San Diego before there was a city there. So I have to imagine, I'd love to have his life story, but we don't know enough about it. But while he was working for Apollinaire, he was neurotically and consistently stealing things from the Louvre. He was probably a kleptomaniac, which is a mania that impels you to steal things, and he was focused on stealing from the Louvre. And his girlfriend once reported that he had said, "Honey, I'm going to the Louvre, do you want anything?" And she thought he meant the Louvre. There was a shopping arcade next to the Louvre, but he meant the museum. And this is a time, okay, alarms had been invented, but they were irregular. They would go off when you didn't want them to or not at all, and they were irregularly implemented. So security at the Louvre was locking the doors at night and having security guards walk around, but there weren't enough of them. And you had exhibitions of sculptures with just, sculptures sitting on a table or on a plinth that weren't fixed into place. And you didn't have glass vitrines, and you didn't have works of art bolted to walls. It was very primitive in terms of security. And there had been murmurs among the liberal media at the time, basically poking fun at the conservatives running the French government that, this is such a mess, the security so lax, one day somebody's going to steal the Mona Lisa. And that would take place. But before that, in 1907, Géry Pierret, with the help of others, almost certainly Picasso and Apollinaire, that's not me, that's, okay. I have a timer, so I'll be right on time for you people, and I don't know what sound my watch will make, so this is why I'm asking. So at least 3 people were involved. They snuck into the Louvre and removed 3 statue heads, the Iberian statue heads, the very ones that Picasso had admired in the previous exhibition that he had seen. And when Géry Pierret was later asked about this, he said it was his idea. He went and stole all 3 of them by himself. He put them all underneath his trench coat, and he had the balls to ask a security guard for directions to the nearest exit. And he brought them to Picasso, and Picasso had never seen them before, but quite liked them and bought them from him. That's the official story. That doesn't make a lick of sense, because each one of these statue heads weighs about 7 kilos. I've been living in Europe long enough that I don't know either what a kilo or a pound is. I'm sort of halfway in between, but you can't carry 3 of them by yourself under your trench coat. So he had accomplices. Also, He claimed he was just wandering the galleries and, saw something that looked interesting and said, okay, well, I'm going to steal those. In fact, these were in storage because they were of no particular artistic importance as individual works of art. They were of cultural and historical importance as ancient objects, but they were no longer part of an art exhibit. And as a result, they were in storage. So someone had targeted them, gone into Louvre storage to retrieve these 3 objects. And then, where did they end up? Well, Picasso's girlfriend at the time, Fernande Olivier, wrote a diary, and she said how weird it was that all of Picasso's art collection was on display in his studio, except for these statue heads that he kept, hidden away in his sock drawer. And so, of course, he knew what they were, and he certainly commissioned the theft, and he was probably involved in it. The most frequent question I'm asked, because I'm a specialist in art crime, is, do criminal collectors exist like the ones we think of from movies? And the answer is almost never in known history, except for a few exceptions like Picasso. So it's a great side story, but we got to catch up a little bit. Here's 2 of the statue heads here. This is the one that Picasso most admired, and he admired it so much that towards the end of his life, in a profile in Life magazine, he remembered jokingly, I remember that time that we stole from the Louvre, I remember this. So it wasn't a big secret, but surprising that people haven't heard of it, considering how famous Picasso is. This is called the Affaire des Statuettes, and it's much more elaborate and complicated than I'm presenting here. There's a big, long chapter on it in the book with all these quotes, because there was a lot of dialogue among magazines and newspapers at the time about, theorizing who had stolen the Mona Lisa and whether Picasso was involved. And then Géry Pierret, how did they learn that Géry Pierret was involved? Well, Géry Pierret had already been fired by Apollinaire. He was back in Belgium. And he wrote a grumpy letter to a Parisian newspaper saying, how dare somebody steal the Mona Lisa? I was going to do that. And now the security is going to be much tighter. And because police knew that he had been associated with Apollinaire, and Apollinaire was with Picasso, they knocked on their doors and arrested them and brought them in for questioning. And Picasso was so terrified that he claimed he had never seen Apollinaire before in his life, and they're best friends, and there are all these photos of the 2 of them hanging out in newspapers. He was afraid of being deported back to Spain. He wanted to remain in Paris. And Apollinaire was born in Poland, and he was also a big Francophile. And he didn't want to be, to have to leave, but he also wanted to be embraced by the society that he so admired. And an indirect side effect of this is that he would enlist in the French army in World War I and die during the war. And he might not have done that had he not felt the need to show that he was a loyal Frenchman after this very public affair. Why is this important to the history of art? I love when crime and cultural history mingle. Well, this is an important theft to the history of art, because the work of art that really established Picasso as a great master is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is considered the first work of artistic modernism, painted in 1907. And these 2 statue heads inspired the mask-like faces of the prostitutes portrayed in this monumental work of art. So we have a direct connection between Picasso's art theft and the establishment of artistic modernism and the launch of his career. Now, you're probably wondering what happened to this guy, right? If you remember, where do we leave off? So he had a doorknob in his pocket. He had the Mona Lisa under his arm in a white sheet. But he was locked inside the museum, and the footsteps were coming down the stairs. Turns out it was a janitor. And the janitor came down the stairs, and I would love to have like a dialogue of how this shook out, but apparently he wasn't so surprised that someone wearing a Louvre worker's uniform had been accidentally locked in overnight. No word about whether the Mona Lisa-shaped package wrapped in a white sheet under his arm raised suspicions, or why he looked at the door and saw that the doorknob was missing. But he had keys, and he unlocked the door, and he let Perugia out. And so Perugia disappears into early morning Paris. The only clue that was given to the police the day after is that someone who had been setting up their shop at the Louvre shopping arcade across the street had thought it was weird that he had seen a Louvre worker come out of the museum and throw something over his shoulder as he crossed the Seine River. And the police went to investigate. It was a doorknob. So the investigation was a complete disaster. The director of the Louvre at the time had been away. The person who was in charge resigned in disgrace as the director. And the investigator was a guy named Louis Lepine. Louis Lepine was at the time quite famous as a very iron-fisted riot breaker in Paris. It was a little short guy with a big mustache and a very tall hat. I'm saying that like you must know that these are people are not to be trusted, but that's just what he looked like. And he was famous for also promoting the use of forensics, which was relatively new in policing. So the history of forensic and policing dates back to a French detective named Vidocq in the late 18th century, and then to a Scottish-American named Alan Pinkerton, who you might have heard of, who founded the Pinkerton Agency, and founded the precursors to the Secret Service, the CIA, the FBI, and also mercenary companies that are hired by the government. So it was very influential. And Lepine was an admirer of these techniques and used things like fingerprinting when it was relatively new. It's hard for us to imagine now, but you used to have to find somebody who knew somebody to figure out who somebody was. You had to, Joe Schmagegi had to recognize their neighbor to tell you who it was. Otherwise, there wasn't a way of identifying people. For a period of time, they used basically the distances between facial features and the span of your head as a unique characteristic until there was one, or rather a pair of convicts at the same prison in England who had the same first name, middle name, and surname, same birthday, and the exact same dimensions for all aspects of their head. And then we got to figure out a better way. And people developed fingerprinting, but it was relatively new. Of course, ages before DNA, but fingerprinting and photography, taking a mugshot, was relatively new. And so this is the official mugshot of Vincenzo Peruggia. But Lepine arrives at the scene of the crime a day late because the Mona Lisa, the Louvre had been closed on a Monday, so it wasn't until the next day that somebody noticed that the painting was missing. We have these ace security guards at the time. And he seals off the museum way too late. And he interviews everyone who has any association with the museum, including he interviewed Peruggia twice and never thought he was a suspect. That may have to do with this sort of mild racism, an Italian couldn't possibly pull this off kind of deal. We don't know. But so what was he doing? Vincenzo Peruggia was still working for the same company. He was still playing the mandolin in his spare time and cultivating his mustache. But he kept the Mona Lisa for 2 years. Apparently, he had no idea what to do with it. But he thought, okay, it doesn't belong to France. Ain't no way. Napoleon took it for certain. That was his assumption. There was a list found in his apartment with names of wealthy American collectors. So he may have thought, can I get this to America to sell it? But I'm sure he realized he didn't have any of the capabilities to do so. He was working entirely alone. And so he hatched this plan to repatriate it to Italy. I'm going to take a very short sidestep here because it's such an interesting story. So you're probably thinking to yourselves, I've heard various conspiracy theories and intrigues about why it was stolen and that there's maybe multiple copies of the original and this sort of stuff. Well, we're in an era, unfortunately, of fake news, but fake news isn't anything new. If we go back in time to the 1930s, there was an infamous journalist who seems to have made up all of the big stories that he wrote. His name was Carl Decker. I don't even know if that was his name, but that's what he signed off with. And he wrote an article that was the equivalent of a viral article today, but it appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, which was a reliable newspaper, most famous because Norman Rockwell did the covers for it. So the Saturday Evening Post ran an article in 1934 by Carl Decker. And it starts out, Carl Decker said, about 20 years ago, I was in Casablanca. It already sounds suspicious, right? And I was having coffee with an Argentine count named Valfierno. And he told me this great story. He's told me that he commissioned Perugia to steal the Mona Lisa and bring it to him. And he was a master art forger. And he painted 10 exact copies of it. And he sold each one to a different really dumb American millionaire. This is what they thought of American millionaires back in the day. Each one thought they had the stolen original, but it was stolen so they couldn't tell anyone about it. And he kept the original himself. And the one returned to the Louvre was one of his 10 copies. This was written as a factual article, and most people believed it because of the source and because it wasn't until much later that Carl Decker's, all of the articles that he wrote were demonstrated to have been fabricated, or rather there was no evidence to support them at all. But the problem was it took root in the popular imagination. And so a lot of people, this was the subject also of the talk that I gave back in 2017 here, a lot of people think that people steal art in order to make copies of it, and that there are various forgeries floating around. And in fact, while that has happened on occasion, it doesn't regularly happen at all, and it certainly didn't happen in this case. There was no Valfierno in real life, but the general public tended to think there was. And it also influenced popular fiction, which influenced the way people think about real life, because more people read the fiction than the nonfiction, especially if the nonfiction isn't 100% accurate, as in the case of this story. So getting back to what happened after Perugia stole the Mona Lisa, he kept it for 2 years. What did he do with it? Well, according to his own account, and we'll get to why he gave his own account in a moment, he was mesmerized by it. It cast a sort of spell over him, almost like a reverse Stockholm syndrome. If you're familiar with the term, Stockholm syndrome is a phenomenon where someone taken hostage falls in love with the person who took them hostage. In this case, the hostage taker, the art napper, fell in love with the object and couldn't bear to be away from it. And he claimed he kept it so in the false bottom of a shipping container under his bed, or in a hidden space behind a stove in his apartment. And he would take it out, he'd get back from work and just stare at it. And he thought he was going crazy eventually. He had no social life, he said. He thought, I got to get rid of this, or this is going to be the end of me. And then he hatched this plan to repatriate it to Italy. So how did he do that? Okay. We'll go back to that slide in a moment. So more than 2 years after the theft, a Florentine art dealer named Alfredo Geri gets a telegram from someone who signs it Leonard, saying, I have the Mona Lisa. I'd like to return it to the Uffizi. Will you help me? And if I can get a reward of about 500,000 lira, I went to a lot of trouble for this. That was the gist of it. And over this 2-year period, there had been all sorts of media reports about the Mona Lisa theft, and this is really why Mona Lisa is the international icon it is today, because it was stolen. Before the theft, before 1911, it was one of the more famous Renaissance paintings, but it was not catapulted to the level of the instant icon it is today, where most people on the planet know what it is at first glance. That's really because it was stolen. And because it was stolen and made international headlines, and it was a drawn-out, ongoing story, that it was a story that wouldn't die, and it kept on. People were tuning in to any little update through newspapers and magazines, and it really became a thing. And it really wasn't until the Titanic sank that the headline shifted away from the Mona Lisa. It enjoyed the limelight for a very long period of time. And there had been various false leads, and Alfredo Geri probably rolled his eyes and thought this was a prank, but he replied, and he said he was prepared to pay that amount of money, but he would need to see the painting. And so he arranged to go to a hotel, which you can visit today in Florence. It's across from the Duomo. It's now called Hotel La Gioconda. And that's where Vincenzo Perugia, a.k.a. Leonard, was staying in a room. And Alfredo Geri brought Giovanni Poggi, who was the director of the Uffizi Museum, with him. And they went to the hotel room, and they see this little guy with a mustache, and he pulls a shipping container out from under his bed and puts it on his bed and opens it, and he removes the false bottom, and there is the Mona Lisa. And they tried to restrain their surprise, and they said, it looks like the real thing, but we have to take it to the Uffizi to be sure and to make sure that it's in a good state. Is that okay with you? Yes, no problem. And we'll have to arrange your reward. And he says, great, I'll wait here. And then the next time, knock on the door, they have the Carabinieri military police opening, and he was completely surprised. He thought he would be welcomed as a national hero. And he was put on trial, but it was like a very cuddly sort of a trial. So one of the reasons we know so much about this, which is very lucky, is court records have a tendency to be preserved much better than other sorts of records. And so we have the transcript of his trial where he spoke. I mean, of course, he was trying to argue his own defense, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. But he said that his only intention was to repatriate this great work to his homeland, and that he never intended to keep it or profit from it other than just being reimbursed for the expenses of all the trouble he went to. And he effectively won the hearts of both the general public and the judge. He was eventually sentenced to 380 days in prison. But he had already been incarcerated for more than that from the time he was arrested until the end of the trial, so he was immediately set free. And someone once asked me, what did he do after? I don't know what he did after, and now I realize we need to have a coda to this. I also want to know what Géry Pierret was doing as a cowboy in San Diego. But I think he went back home to outside of Milan and played the mandolin, but I would like to know if there was a punchline. These days he would be a celebrity on talk shows and whatnot, but not back in the day. So Mona Lisa was displayed at the Uffizi for 2 weeks and then sent back to Paris. And this whole story is what really catapulted it into the limelight. Now, I have just enough time to briefly talk about two other aspects of the story that are intriguing to me, because this book of mine tells about the theft, it tells about Picasso's affaire des statuettes, the statuette affair, but it's also trying to be a complete story of the Mona Lisa. And you can't tell the whole story without talking about the various copies of it and the questions of whether any of them might also have been done by Leonardo. So we have the original, of course. The one in the Louvre is the original. There's no doubt about that. There's all sorts of kooky theories out there if you want to, that there's like hieroglyphics written in her eyeballs and there's a secret picture of an alligator and whatever you want. None of it holds water, but there's enough interesting stuff going on that we don't need hidden alligators and hieroglyphics. So there are 4 candidates for versions of the Mona Lisa that were not necessarily made by Leonardo, probably not, but that were almost certainly made in his studio while he was painting the original. Now, that's a distinction that may be confusing, but the bodega system, which is a studio system that developed in Europe in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, and Leonardo's studio was part of it, saw the master as the front man for the studio, the one whose name would be associated with any works produced by it. But he had a studio of a handful up to about, I think 14 was usually the maximum number of assistants and apprentices. And apprentices would be anywhere from age 8 to 16, and they would live usually with the master and be housed and fed and taught the trade in exchange for being, like gophers and assistants. And then you had paid assistants as well. And sometimes you would have a paid assistant who was better than the master. So, for example, there is an okay but not very exciting Roman painter named Cavalieri d'Arpino who had an assistant named Caravaggio, who's one of the great artists ever, or Antony van Dyck was an assistant of Rubens's, and many would say that he outdid his master. But this was a system in place, and we'll talk about also, if anyone is coming back this afternoon, that this bottega system was like a smelly guy's locker room, and there was no room for ladies, which is the main reason why, until we get to the 20th century, the really exceptional female artists were few and far between, because they were effectively not welcomed into the system through which people developed their artistic talents, because it was a man's locker room atmosphere of men age 8 to, let's say, 20, and there would be 14 of them stinking up a room, and having young ladies there would be distracting. It was, of course, a very patriarchal society and whatnot. We'll talk about that later this afternoon if anyone's coming to the second lecture. But members of the studio of Leonardo, their job was to create art that was indistinguishable from that of the master, because their hands would be touching the exact same works that were coming out of the studio as by the master. So anything coming from Leonardo's studio was considered by Leonardo. But how much of it he would have painted is a question. And that usually would reflect how much the commissioners paid. You pay the most, he paints all of it. You pay the least, he designs and supervises it, but he might not paint any of it himself. And walking through the galleries today, I saw you have an angel by Rubens that is completely by Rubens, and that's very unusual, because Rubens had so many assistants. He had an illegally high number of assistants. It was like the Rubens factory. Usually the local painters' guilds, called the Guild of St. Luke, because he was the patron saint of painters, would have the maximum number to not dilute the products of a studio too much. And Rubens had like 36 or something at one point when you're supposed to have 14. I can't remember the numbers. But so it's an art historian game. We're nerds like that, where if you see a Rubens, you're like, okay, how much of this did he actually make? So it's pretty cool if there's something that he made entirely. So the point is your ability as an assistant to replicate the work, the style of your master, so that you cannot distinguish where the master's work ends and yours begins. That was the goal. And so it gets complicated, because there are all sorts of works by the studio of Leonardo that have sometimes been attributed to him. This is called the Mona Vana. It's unrelated to Mona Lisa. It looks a little like her because of the pose, but it's basically a nude lady, a study of a nude lady, but it's not meant to be Lisa Gherardini in particular. In fact, this Mona Lisa is not really what Lisa Gherardini looked like. This is supposedly what she actually looked like. And here's where it gets complicated. So we have multiple Mona Lisas that probably came out of Leonardo's studio. And so what people are curious about is, did he paint more than one? It doesn't get less complicated when I tell you that there are Leonardo works that he painted in multiples. He painted 2 versions of Madonna of the Yarn Winder, and he painted Madonna of the Rocks and Virgin of the Rocks, which are almost identical. So that's not unusual. If someone would commission a work of art, and then someone would say, I like that, can I have one, please? And they paid for it, no problem. But as far as we know, I'm cutting to the chase here, there's only one that Leonardo made himself. But the one he made himself, the one that's at the Louvre, has 3 paintings under it. The first one is a study of a woman. Whoops. No, there we go. It's like the conspiracy theorists don't want me to keep on going. The second is a study that looks like it was meant to be a Madonna, a Virgin Mary. The third looks more like this. And the fourth is the surface that we see. Why the differences? Well, materials were very expensive at the time. And Leonardo never felt like he completed Mona Lisa. In fact, he was quoted as saying he thought he never finished a single one of his paintings, which is probably hyperbole, but he was not really interested in painting. He made most of his money as a musician. He was one of the most famous musicians in Europe. He played an instrument called the lira de braccio, which is like a violin, lyre, guitar hybrid. And he made most of his money doing that or military engineering. He sold his talents as a military engineer to different Italian city-states. And he didn't make a lot of paintings Paintings was a sideline, and he was more interested in experimenting with materials and studying things like human anatomy and engineering than he was about the painting. So the painting was like, oh, by the way, I paint in the afternoons, this kind of thing. So he probably reused the same support. Support is the word for the surface on which a painting is made, because sometimes oak or poplar wood panels cost more than any other aspect of a work of art. There were specialist panel makers who would have the best pieces of wood specially treated so they could have no wormholes. There were certain wood types like poplar that resisted insect infestations. You would join them to make larger boards. The panel itself was very expensive. The pigments were also super expensive. They were all made from natural ingredients. You had to buy the natural ingredients. It was so expensive that you couldn't really make art on spec at this era. You could do drawings maybe, but even paper was very expensive. So if you had a good panel, you were going to use it as much as you can and hopefully get a finished product out of it. So it's not unusual to have what are called pentimenti. This is an Italian word. It basically, it's linked to the word like repenting or wishing you had done something differently. And a pentimento is, let's say, a mistake I made that I then corrected by painting over. And what's fun about pentimenti is we can look at paintings using various light spectra, like X-rays, ultraviolet, infrared, and we can see beneath the surface of paint without damaging it. And so you can use these techniques to see pentimenti, to see changes. For example, let's say in the original version, I didn't like the way the arms were crossed. I had an arm up here. But then I decided, you know what, I don't like that, so I'm going to paint over it, and the arm's going to be like this. Well, you can't see that on the surface, but you can see it looking at these works of art with different light spectra. And a French technician named Pascal Cotte invented something called LAM, the name of which is escaping me, but it's definitely called LAM. I'll get back to you. It was a special technique to let him see under layers and also develop them fully. So if you look at like an infrared spectroscopic image, sometimes it's hard to see what you're seeing. His technique, this LAM technique, made it so that you could really see a complete looking painting. And so this is an image that he developed using his technique of what he thinks was one of the original under images to Mona Lisa. The one, or the version that made the biggest headlines was from the Museo del Prado in Madrid. The Prado Mona Lisa, what's interesting about it is it has all of the same pentimenti as the original. If you think about that, why is that interesting? Well, if I'm making a copy of a finished painting, I'm not going to make the mistakes underneath that I have to paint over. I'm just going to look at the finished one and copy it. So the fact that it has the same pentimenti suggests that it was made in real time alongside the original, which means it was made by someone in Leonardo's studio or theoretically by Leonardo himself. But that also doesn't make sense, because why would he make two versions? He hasn't gotten paid for this, remember. The commission originally was for one of his father's buddies. Why would he make two versions and make mistakes and change them both at the same time? So logically, one was done by one of his assistants as a learning exercise, and one was done by him, and he was changing his mind, and that meant the assistant had to make the changes along with him. But the assistant stopped. Where's the Prado one? No, this is the Prado one. The assistant stopped when it looked like this. You can see it looks kind of like a hybrid between her and her. Stopped at this stage. But Leonardo lived longer, brought this painting with him. This is one of the paintings he kept with him to the end of his life and was basically playing around with it for a very long time. The technique, LAM technique, also showed that Mona Lisa used to have a veil over her face, eyebrows. She doesn't have eyebrows anymore. It was much brighter with a bluer background. You can see here. This is what this is what it looks like now, and this is what it probably looked like prior. So it's complicated. It's a layer cake. A lot of works of art are especially on these expensive panels, and it's frankly, it's confusing to keep track of, which is where you can get this misinformation that that maybe it was by Leonardo, or maybe there are alligators and hieroglyphs here and there. One of the things that I think is interesting is people know of this work of art. It's so famous, and there's a tendency to want to superimpose more of a story than is actually supported by documentary evidence, because you want to make more of a meal of it. But I think it's got plenty going on here. And I have exactly 4 minutes left to give you the super quick version of what happened to the Mona Lisa during World War II. And of course, for the full version, you have in the book. So there's two versions of what happened to the Mona Lisa during World War II. There's an official version, which only came out about 20 years ago. It was a mystery as to what happened to it during the Second World War. But then there was an official French government announcement, release of archival material, and the big hero saving so many of France's treasures during World War II was the Director General of Museums, a guy named Jacques Jaujard. And he organized the very quick boxing up and evacuation of not only the Louvre, but all of the French collections in Paris prior to the Nazi occupation of the city. And he packaged everything up with his team in about 3 days, because it was known that the Nazis would try to confiscate anything that they could. And at that time, it wasn't known in France that there was a Nazi art theft division called the ERR, responsible for moving an estimated 5 million cultural heritage objects. But it was known that they had a taste for taking art. Particularly Hitler was fascinated with, he had sort of basic needs. Very big, very realistic paintings, please, by Germanic or Scandinavian artists. That was his thing. Hermann Göring was also, he's the Nazi #2, the head of the Luftwaffe, and he personally stole around 7,000 works of art for his own collection, most of which were first taken by the ERR, which was the official art theft division, and then he appropriated the pieces that he wanted. So all these are boxed up. Mona Lisa is boxed up as well, but it's put in its own special transport container. It's marked MN, so that it was sort of coded so people wouldn't necessarily know what it was. And the most valuable works of art were coated with a red paint on the outside of the box. But to get it out of Paris first, it was put with a curator in the back of an ambulance truck and driven out of the city. And the curator almost died because there wasn't enough air in the back of the ambulance truck. But they made it out. And then it was placed in a series of castles, along with other treasures from French museums. The first one was a castle called Chambord in the Loire Valley, which is kind of fun because this was the largest castle there, and it has a famous staircase designed by Leonardo. It's a double helix design, so it's 2 staircases. They both start at the same point, and they've got like a cylindrical stairwell tube in the middle, and they wrap around this tube, but they never meet. And when I was little, I went to France a couple times with my parents. My mom was a French professor, and I remember playing like tag on the staircases, because you could go up one and you could see people across through the windows on the other staircase, but they would never meet. So it was a kind of fun little side story. But the Nazis kept on occupying further south in France, and there was a concern that they were going to occupy the places that were storage facilities. So they moved it from Chambord to another castle. There were a series of locations, I think about 5 in all. There were 2 periods during the Second World War of 2 years each where Mona Lisa didn't move, as far as we know. But then eventually, when the war ended, it was returned along with the other Louvre treasures to Paris. That's the official story. That sounds fine. Why am I telling you a second story? Well, in 2010, I published a book called Stealing the Mystic Lamb, which is the true story of the Ghent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck, which is the most frequently stolen artwork in history, and which I can argue is the most influential painting ever made. So we're all Americans, we like superlatives. I live in Europe and people are like, the most, really? We need to do that? The Americans we want the biggest, the smallest, the fastest, the slowest. We're not interested in the 15th fastest. So superlatives, yes. And part of that story is the fate of the Ghent altarpiece during World War II and how a group of American officers called the Monuments Men, who you might have heard of, who were art historians and architects whose job was to try to locate and preserve cultural heritage monuments and objects that were at risk during the fighting. A pair of them, one named Robert Posey and Lincoln Kirstein, and if you've heard of Lincoln Kirstein, he's one of the founders of the New York City Ballet after the war, how they accidentally learned about the existence of the ERR and how they worked with members of the Austrian resistance who corresponded with the British Special Operations Executive, their spy division, because they learned that most of the most famous stolen objects from Europe, Nazi-occupied Europe, were all stored in one place, a secret salt mine in a place called Altassee in the Austrian Alps. It's like a James Bond villain's hideout. I've filmed a bunch of TV programs there for Discovery Channel and the official tie-in for the Monuments Men film with National Geographic, and it's super fun. And this was where 12,000 most famous artworks from Nazi-occupied Europe were stored during the war. The end game was supposed to be the creation of a super museum. Hitler was obsessed with this idea that he would take his boyhood town of Linz, Austria, he would knock the whole thing down and make a citywide museum with every important artwork in the world. It was also going to have a wing of degenerate art. That's art that the Nazis saved the world from, like abstract minimalist art or art by people of races or communities that the Nazis disapproved of. But the centerpiece was going to be the Ghent altarpiece. This was Hitler's favorite work of art. Among those 12,000 works that were stored in this secret salt mine and narrowly avoided destruction, but that's a story for a different lecture, when the objects were itemized, among the official listings as itemized by a trained member of the Monuments Men's team was the Mona Lisa from the Louvre. So what's the deal? How could it be there and also never left France? In my book, I have I think a reasonable jiving of the two together where they can both coexist as theses. I think what probably happened is that the original never left France, but one of the contemporary copies was stolen by the Nazis thinking it was the original and listed as such in their documents and recovered by someone who may or may not have known that it was the original or versus a copy. And that's why it was listed as having been found there. What they found there was probably one of the contemporary copies. So I think I'm totally on time, possibly. I hope you enjoyed this talk. If you have time to come to the one at 6 o'clock, it's going to be a totally different subject. But thank you so much for taking the time to come out, and I'm very happy to take some questions.